Your hair looks
Nothing.
gorgeous.
There's like this one little piece here. You just like this
Honestly,
one. And I keep seeing it in the film.
it's gorgeous. I feel that where you like see it, no one notices.
I'm like, fuck, none of this matters.
None of it matters.
Nothing matters. But all right. Wait,
But
I
this
think
matters. This topic matters.
this question is very funny though.
Let me hear. Let me
If
hear it.
you Haley, listener Haley wrote in, she said, if you had to play in a pro sporting event with no prior experience, which would it be? That is such a funny question, right?
Such a good
So
question.
you don't get to pick tennis because you already play tennis, for the record.
It would definitely not be tennis.
Okay.
I'm going to talk through this. I'm going to talk through this with you. Okay, ready? It would definitely be like a team sport.
No.
Because you wouldn't be able to tell.
Mm.
I could hide in other people.
Yeah, but then you're disappointing other people. That's horrible.
Oh, well, no,
You're
could
like
just be
at the Olympics
sorry.
and you fuck up their team.
But think about, yeah, that's fair. But think about like if all of the attention was on you as like if you're playing tennis.
That's fine. I have no shame. I'd rather just take myself down.
Oh, wow. That's nice. Yeah. No,
I already know this is.
I would rather hide in other people. This really fits with our personalities.
Yes.
Also, it brings me to a stupid story when when you were in elementary school, maybe, and they would ask if you wanted to like play instruments. Did that happen with you?
Yes.
So
Flute.
I also played the flute.
Of course.
I played the violin and I played the flute.
Classy.
I just really thought it was very cool. And it is very cool to be able to play an instrument, but it's not, I feel like it's like speaking a language. You either pick it up very quickly or you don't.
Yes.
I am not an instrument girl. Just did not pick it up. I did not practice. I wasn't into it. But so when it came time for the
recital
when I was playing violin,
no,
I just would pretend like I was moving like the bow, and I would just like move the bow with everyone else to pretend.
Did anyone catch you?
No one knew.
So, okay, so now I sort of understand where you're coming from with the team sport thing.
Exactly. Like that's kind of how.
Okay. So what sport? You have to choose the team sport.
Does dance count?
Jen, you're such a bad dancer.
Excuse me. I was on a hip hop competition team.
I understand. And also I've seen your moves. So I'm just saying.
Listen, I'm going to
We call you Asparagus Jen for a reason.
Yeah, I know. Like, listen, I can't help my lanky limbs. Okay. Can't help them. It's just something that comes natural. But I think depending on what type of dance you're doing, it might really enhance my dance moves.
I've tried to learn a TikTok dance with you as well.
Yeah, that was horrible. That went horribly. So
dance team is your choice.
Yeah, because then you can hide in the back.
Yeah, I think I'd go for bowling.
We're picking like, but I don't know if the person who asked this question was expecting for us to pick these sports.
I definitely would not do anything that's a team sport. And I believe bowling is not, correct?
No, definitely a team sport.
Oh, it is. Okay, never mind.
I think maybe it can be.
Darts? Like I would pick something that like I could, because here's the thing, I'm going down no matter what. I just don't want to take anyone down with me.
Maybe I would do synchronized swimming. You just stick your legs up in the air and wave them around. I would drown.
It would be very clear how unsynchronized it was once you started swimming. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And let's hope. Here's the reason why I wouldn't do a team sport is guilt. And today's episode is about guilt.
So good. Yes. I would just live with my guilt.
Listen, guilt is a pervasive emotion for me.
Oh, tell me.
Guilt is something I feel so easily.
Do you think you have guilt proneness?
I have guilt proneness. Yes. Okay. So why is somebody wrote in? Let's start off. Why is guilt such an easily felt emotion for me? Why is it my go-to?
So the perpetual feeling of guilt is known as guilt proneness. For people who experience guilt proneness, they're believed to have a strong connection with their own and others' emotions. So you might be someone who's very connected to your emotional world. Research actually suggests that guilt proneness may be related to empathy as well as trustworthiness. So if you are this person, guilt might come up often for you, but I think it's important to decipher between the two categories of guilt.
Mhm.
Um, one of them being healthy, appropriate guilt, right? So it's a feeling of guilt for a
I kill someone.
justifiable, right? You should feel guilt, right? For
Reasonable.
a justifiable reason.
Yes.
It's our conscience telling us that maybe we've done something wrong, and it stops us from repeating or making mistakes. So it gives us the opportunity to learn and change our behavior in the future. So there is a reason as human beings why guilt is built into our emotional system because it helps us learn from our mistakes. It can be very useful. On the other hand, irrational guilt is when we mistakenly assume responsibility for a situation or overestimate the suffering caused to another person, and how damaging that suffering
Mhm.
is if we don't take steps to resolve it. So, an irrational guilt is linked to anxiety, depression, dysphoria, OCD, PTSD. So, there's a lot of links to irrational guilt. Um, there's also childhood underpinnings of that if guilt was really brought into the conversation with our families. Um, and if you have this persistent and excessive guilt, it may be contributing to low self esteem for you, feeling like you're not a good person, excessively worrying about other people's perceptions, a sensitivity to criticism, weak or poor boundaries, a betrayal of personal values or core beliefs, um, and just feeling overwhelmed by simple decisions.
So interesting goes also, one of the other things is that I'm sorry, I'm having a microphone move around. Okay, good.
Okay.
Sorry, I apologize for that. Somebody edit that. Okay, so there's another part of like feeling like sometimes like feeling a sense of wrongdoing. So people that have like very big moral compasses, right? Like I feel guilty for shopping on Temu. Like, right? Like, you're someone who like has like a very high moral compass or is very into morals and ethics, you're probably going to feel guilty more. Or if you had a household where guilt was used in a communication method. So if you have been told that it's bad to be loud or opinionated, it might be that you feel really wrong and guilty if you speak up in a meeting or if you have a different opinion than somebody, any of these things. So let's say the guilt feels like your default reaction, right? It's just something. So you talked about this pervasive guilt, or I'm sorry, what was the word? What was the word?
Guilt
It's a bad
proneness.
episode. Then we're gonna feel guilty about how we did on this
Yes,
episode.
yes, already.
So let's say it's like your default reaction, right? So somebody wrote in that said, guilt feels like my default reaction. How do I accept I'm doing enough as a mom, wife, and a person? So the first question I'm going to ask is, what would you mean by quote unquote doing enough? What are you expecting from yourself internally? And what messages are you receiving externally? Because if you have this idea, if you have an expectation for yourself, I should have dinner on the table 7 nights a week, and then you only have it two, you're probably going to feel guilty for being a bad mom.
She's using quotes with her hands if you're not watching this on YouTube.
Yes. Oh, sorry. If you feel like being quote unquote a bad mom.
But I think that brings up a really good point that we don't necessarily bring into the conversation enough when we talk about guilt is expectations of ourselves and where those expectations have developed from. You know, you hear a lot about guilt playing a role when you grew up in maybe a very religious environment where maybe you were taught that certain very human things, sexual desires, urges, um, sexual preferences are quote unquote bad in some way, that you're doing something wrong. And you develop this sense of, I am bad for being me, right?
Mhm.
I'm doing something wrong because of this expectation I have developed about who I'm supposed to be. And, when we talk about this in terms of being a mom, you hear a lot about mom guilt of have this expectation of myself, of how I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to be doing. And if I'm not meeting that, then I feel guilt. I'm doing something wrong. I'm hurting my child in some way. When I wonder if you can look at the expectations that you have developed for yourself about who you're supposed to be and ask yourself, is this actually realistic?
Mhm.
Does this actually make sense? And if I'm not meeting this, does it mean I'm doing something bad?
So there's such an overlap between rigidity and guilt, right?
Yes.
Because I even think about it in terms of like diet culture, right? Like how people will be like, oh, well, I feel guilty after I ate. If you feel guilty because you ate something, it's now. If you should feel guilty is you're sitting at a restaurant, you walk up to someone else's plate and you eat off theirs. That's weird. Don't be doing that. You should feel a little weird about that, man. It's bad eating.
You
Don't
don't
take food off
I
of
do
someone
that
else's plate.
I do that every time I go to a restaurant.
Well, we have
You
should talk
think,
about that and you should feel guilty. But
right?
right,
I
so
don't
like that's an example of like bad eating.
right,
Don't do that.
right.
But besides that, everything else is good. But the amount you hear people talk about guilt with food.
Mm,
I ate too many carbs. I did this. I did that. There was too much sugar, right? That's the rigidity of diet culture. I didn't get to my workout. I feel really guilty. Why do you think you have to work out every single day? If you it feels great, that's great. But also if it's healthy, that means you can take days off. And so I think that there's this massive overlap with rigidity and guilt.
mm. And which actually brings me to a really good point, because guilt usually comes up when you act or think in a way that goes against your beliefs, your family values, social norms, workplace ethics. So within some of those categories, if you're very rigid in your beliefs, if you're very rigid in this is how it's supposed to be, then it makes a lot of sense that guilt would come up more often, because you have no flexibility in your thinking around some of
Yep.
these things.
So
And you're often saying to yourself, "Oh, I'm bad because I did not fit into this category. I've done
absolutely.
something wrong."
So then let's talk about a lot of people asked about how do you not feel guilty about other people's feelings? There were so many variations of this question, right? So somebody else also wrote out like, am I really not responsible for people's feelings? Like that, I do not understand. How do I navigate feeling guilty with any boundaries? And it's the same sort of question, right? So I think the thing we're talking about is that like somewhere you were taught that it's wrong for other people to feel upset. And you were so uncomfortable in other people's discomfort that you'd rather just take it all on yourself.
Mhm.
So the question is, at what point did you learn that other people hurting or being upset was bad, problematic, or your fault? Because the reality is even if somebody ends up hurt by our behavior, it does not mean that we caused harm.
Yes.
Those are different things,
If you slap
right?
someone in the face,
Causing harm,
causing harm,
deliberate. You
right?
should
You
feel,
feel guilty.
yes. Now, if that person's a Nazi, I don't know.
Right.
I'm just saying.
Great point. Great point. Right. I mean,
I'm
that's
just
where like
saying.
the
Yes.
moral piece comes in, right?
What's the context of the situation going on,
Right.
right?
Great. Great
But
point.
and the context does matter, right? If I yell at my daughter because she's about to run into the right, this is every freaking time you're in a parking lot. I'm like, hand on the car. We're in a parking lot, right? I will yell at my daughter when it
Yes.
is safety. That is very different than me coming home after a stressful day at work and me yelling at her just because I'm mad. And so these things, right, should bring up different experience. I'm not going to ever feel guilty that I yelled at my daughter in a parking lot so that she's safe. I don't give a fuck.
And you know what's interesting, right? So like if you use that example, Millie might cry in both situations.
Yes.
So her reaction might be the same in both situations.
Mhm.
And so if the question is, how do you not feel guilty about other people's feelings? You have to decipher between, did this fit with my values, my morals? As a mother, I want to make sure my daughter is safe. And
Yes.
so me yelling at her in a parking lot, even though she's crying, fit with my values. It made sense to me. At home, if I had a stressful day, I understand that it wasn't about her and it was really about what was going on for me. That doesn't fit with my values.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really good question to ask yourself, is that someone else might be upset. Did your actions, what you did, fit with your values?
Yeah. And the same thing, right? And so let's talk about this because we're obviously, it doesn't seem like we can talk about guilt without talking about boundaries
Yes.
because so many people are struggling with guilt around setting boundaries. And once again, this is something to keep in mind. If I am setting a boundary because it is significant for me, it's important for me. That's very different than I'm setting boundaries because I want to hurt you.
Right.
And I've never heard anyone talk about setting a boundary because you want to fuck someone else over.
Right. I don't even know if I would call that a boundary.
No,
It's
it's not. Yeah.
like a cutoff, or if
Yes.
it's
Yes.
some sort of like manipulation in some
Mhm.
way, right?
Mhm.
Is you're deliberately doing something to hurt someone else, or
Yeah.
um and here's the thing, and I think when you have a reaction, like let's say, I don't know, someone's calling you nonstop and they're talking to you on the phone and you can never get off the phone, and you have built up this resentment over time. And then you react to them by saying, "Well, I can't fucking talk to you for this long anymore." And you hang up on them. I wouldn't call that setting a boundary. I would call that having a reaction to the resentment that you've built up over time. So
Yes.
you might have guilt about a reaction that you have. Setting a boundary is saying, hey, listen, at 6 o'clock, I want to be with my family. I can't talk on the phone, or I don't have a lot of space. I don't have a lot of energy to be able to have this conversation. That is setting a boundary.
Yeah.
The person might have a difficult time with that. It might be hard for them because you're changing something up for them. But the way in which you responded, the way in which you set that boundary may fit more with what your values are. And I think oftentimes we confuse boundaries as a level of like separateness from someone else, where you're actually preserving the relationship. You're making moves to actually be more connected to the person so
Mhm.
that you don't build up a level of resentment towards them, so that you don't have a reaction that doesn't fit with your values, so that doesn't bring about guilt in the relationship.
Yeah. So someone said how to navigate healing from being raised by parents who use guilt as a weapon. And I also want to speak to people specifically here who grew up with family dysfunction of secret keeping and rigidity of boundaries. So if you grew up in a household where you did not talk about what's happening in your household outside the house, if you do not talk about when mom's having a hard time, if you do not talk about what's going on at home, the idea of setting a boundary or talking or getting help or getting support is going to make you feel like you broke a rule. And that's going to make you feel guilty, whether it's healthy or not, right? So sometimes people are like, okay, well, if I feel guilty, I should, right? Because that's what my body's saying, right? So I feel guilty. I must have done something wrong. That is often not the case, but we have been taught that we're doing something wrong. So if you're being raised by parents who use guilt as a weapons, it's going to confuse you with your relationship with guilt.
And the thing that I love that you're talking about, Em, is you may grow up with certain family values, right? Like secret keeping. Um, you get to make the decision as an adult if you want to hold on to those values in as an adult. And so what might be confusing about it is that maybe your family had these values. Maybe if there was dysfunction in your family and secret keeping was important, you grew up with this idea that you should hold on to secrets. as an adult, that might no longer fit with the values that you have as an
Mhm.
individual. And so that might be really important to ask yourself, like, are there certain values that maybe I'm holding on to from growing up in my family that are causing me guilt that no longer fit with the values that I want to uphold as an adult in my own life?
Mhm.
I think that's a really good place to start to figure out, what does that look like for me? Is secret keeping something that I felt was healthy? Or do I need to talk to someone? Do I need more support? What kind of values do I want to hold in my own life? And it might help you with the guilt that you feel or the confusion that you feel around guilt, because then you're deciphering what is mine and what was my family's. What did I grow up with?
Yeah. Um, a lot of people wanna know how to not feel guilty
Ah,
every time.
every time we talk about a specific emotion, the question is, how do I not feel this?
Yeah.
And he will say it again. Any difficult emotion is built within us for a reason,
Mhm.
right? There are times in which it overfunctions for us, right? That irrational guilt. And so it's not about not feeling the emotion. It's about when you feel it, what you do with that emotion, right? Can you recognize that it's irrational? Can you recognize that, oh, this doesn't mean I'm bad in some way? Can you recognize that, oh, maybe my expectations for myself are really high and that's why I'm feeling this guilt?
Yeah.
It's not about getting rid of the feeling. It's about developing a tolerance for the feeling and then understanding, well, what do I want to do with this? How can I use this productively? And are there places where guilt is irrational and it's not useful for me? And so, what am I going to do with that? How am I going to soothe myself? How am I going to tolerate this feeling?
Yeah. So time and experience. That's what we're talking about. You're gonna have to do it a whole bunch of times. A whole bunch of times, and there's still gonna be a twing of it. So here's somebody had written into why do I feel guilty when I say no to someone? I wanna understand the scenario for you. Let's say you came into this life and you had an older sibling who was sort of difficult, right? And when I say difficult as a baby, I mean maybe they were colic or maybe they were allergic to things. Well, like I'm not saying babies are bad, but you had your parents came in and you had a sibling that was more challenging. So you come into this world and babies can like sense this shit. So you somehow come into this world and you're okay sleeping and you don't have colic and you don't have allergies. And then your whole life, your parents praise you for how easy you are. You're so easy. You are such an easy baby. Oh, she's so easy. He's so easy, right? Any of these things, they're so easy. So then at some point you start learning, well, easy's good. Anything else is bad. Being challenging is bad, being defiant is bad, speaking up is bad, being a burden is bad. And so then I say no to someone, and all of a sudden, wait a second, I'm not so easy. That must be wrong. So at some point, you learned that that was wrong. And I think you have to say is one, where did I learn that was wrong? Who taught me that? And what do you feel like it says about you when you say no to someone?
Oof. Okay, what do we got next? Dealer's choice.
There's choice. Okay. Are you ready for one?
I'm ready.
Um, uh, let's talk about guilt versus shame because people always ask this in, and I know we've talked about it again, but just to remind everyone, shame is I am bad, guilt is I did bad,
Hmm.
right? So, like, shame is the next level down, but it is very, very common that guilt leads you into feeling shame. Oh, do you want me to tell a story?
Please, always.
For the record, somebody from my gym could listen to this. I'm going to tell a story that happened this week at the gym. Someone from my gym could hear this and they might feel bad. Don't fucking feel bad. This is my shit. It's not your shit. Okay, go. So this week at the gym, as you may guess, and as you've come to my gym with me, am I maybe a little friendly?
Just a bit.
I talk to everyone. I'm very loud. I have a lot of energy. Usually I've drank in a Celsius before as my pre-workout. So like I'm there to party. Like I am at the gym for the vibes, man. It's why I don't do well at yoga because I'm like, what are we doing? Partying? So, okay, so I'm at my gym and I am often talking, fucking around with people, giving trainers a hard time. There was a new trainer this week, and our lead trainer, Sally, gets on the mic and she goes, so what do we do when there's a new trainer? And somebody goes, Emmalee doesn't talk. Listen, they're not wrong. I'm annoying. And for a new trainer, it's already scary. They're already up there. It is. It would be rude if I talked. But I had a moment of complete shame.
Mm.
Complete shame. Everyone thinks I'm annoying. I should never talk again. Right? Like, and it was funny because I was turning around when they said it. I was like, like had this like total reaction. But what happened after my reaction that I joked about back was like a total shame spiral.
Yeah.
And part of that was a kid being growing up, a kid with ADHD who definitely talks too much. I said, if I ever had a memoir, it would be called Just Stop Talking. Right?
And mine would be say something.
Anything.
Say anything.
And so you have these moments that for a second, I really totally felt like I was a little kid in school getting in trouble again.
Wow. Right. It's like such an activating experience for
Exactly.
you.
Now, obviously, the person who said that did not cause me harm.
Right.
Even if that moment my child was hurting, it had nothing to do with the comment. This person was fucking with me just like how I fuck with everyone. That is
Yes.
it. They did not cause me harm by making a joke, even if I felt hurt.
Mhm.
So they now could hear this and be like, oh, feel really guilty. No, no, no. This is not guilt for them. And that's what you have to separate is people typically don't make us feel a certain way,
Mm.
but it can activate a big feeling from us.
You know what story I thought you were going to tell?
What? Oh God.
No, it's a don't worry. I thought you were saying yesterday how someone said to you, so like you just like talk to people when you go in places, and you're
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's just like who I am.
Yeah.
And like in my mind, before you told that story, I was like, oh, I wish I had that quality, you know? And so it's so interesting because that same thing that like it also brings you shame if someone mentions it
Mm-hmm.
also makes you so approachable and
Mm.
connected to people. I was out for dinner last night at 9 o'clock because you know I eat so late.
I cannot. I am literally getting into bed when Jen is going to dinner.
So I went to dinner. The woman next to me and my husband were sitting at the bar. The woman next to me, like, very clearly wanted to chat. And like, I was not in a chatty mood. So I was just
Should have
like
been sitting next to me.
sitting like this. And I was, and eventually, like, I opened up and I was like chatting with her. It took me like a little, so, you know, it takes me like a little bit of time to warm up. But I am also thinking at the same time, like, how incredible that is to just have that ability to be so open to the people around you, like complete strangers. Where for me, I'm like immediately, if I'm in an environment like that, like there's an immediate wall that comes up, just automatic. And it has nothing to do with like not wanting to connect with people. I think I'm just overstimulated in my environment. So my immediate reaction is to shut down. But I'm getting back to the fact that I thought about you in those moments because I I'm like, that is just a personality type. You know, it's your personality. It's natural. You just immediately talk to anyone. Doesn't matter if you don't know them.
Yeah.
And I see that as such a cool quality to have, just to be that open to people in your environment.
When you were taught that it's bad to be loud, then there's guilt,
Yes.
right? Especially, I think the other thing is like if you are someone who has this pervasive guilt, like you talked about at the beginning, you were like hyper in tune with people, right? So, like, let's say I start a conversation with someone and I can tell they're not into it, which like sometimes they're not. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you're standing getting a cup of coffee. I make some comment about like, oh, that looks really good. And they like don't give me anything back. I have no idea what that person's going through. Right? They could have had the worst conversation of their life. They could just need this cup of coffee. They could have been up all night. You know what I mean? Like I have no effing idea. But there is a ting of like you feel the person's not interested. And there is a part of you that can go was like, oh, that was wrong that I talked to them. I shouldn't have tried to make conversation. The person probably doesn't care about me very much. They're never thinking about it. They're too in their head about something
Right.
else. But when you've been taught that it's bad or wrong to be loud or outspoken, and like it's funny because like I'm very much like my dad. My dad is Like my dad will talk to anyone. Okay, here's an example. For anyone who doesn't know, I live in the same neighborhood as my parents.
Like across the street.
I don't think I'm not across the street,
Oh,
4 houses down across the street. I don't think I've ever admitted this on the show. And I would also like to say that I moved into the neighborhood first. They moved in afterwards. But it's great. It works out really well. I have an amazing relationship with my parents. My daughter can go right up the street and see them. It's amazing. But here's the funny part. So, okay, so I moved in 2 or 3 years before my parents. We were last week, lots of snow here. We were sledding with a bunch of neighborhood kids. And one of this another, family I hadn't met before in the neighborhood, it's a pretty big neighborhood, was like, "Oh, you're Buck's daughter." And I'm like, "Oh my God."
still.
They have lived here for like a year and I am his daughter. But that's because that's who my dad is. I am him so much. He talks to everyone. He's friends with everyone. He has no idea who they are. Ask him. I could ask him your name and he probably doesn't know. My dad just like don't know your friends no matter what.
Yes. Yes.
But my mom is incredibly friendly, but she's not as outgoing as me and my dad are. She's
Okay.
way more reserved. So I think you look at your parents and you're like, I want to be like that. And like there's something that's much safer about not being the outspoken one that I
Yes.
always wish I was more like my mom and less like my dad.
Wow.
And the guilt that comes with being more
Well, I also
outspoken.
think if you in school, like school's a perfect example. You're taught to be quiet. You're
Mhm.
taught to hold yourself in, right? And if it comes naturally to you to talk to everyone, to have conversations, and you're consistently getting scolded for that and told that you're wrong in some way, you're being told that something that comes so naturally to you is bad. I mean, it's the same thing someone asked. Um, where is it? Someone asked about feeling guilty about being an empath.
Oh, I saw
And
that. Yeah, yeah.
someone said, like, oh, I feel guilty about being an empath. In the same way, right? We grow up in a culture that says if you're too sensitive, there's something wrong, right? Like society is uncomfortable with difficult emotions. So if you're too sensitive and you're expressing that, you're wrong in some way. And so you have these consistent experiences that might tell you that something that comes naturally to you is wrong and you're doing something wrong and you're affecting other people, right? Because you're crying, you're making other people uncomfortable. So that means that you're wrong.
Mhm.
When this is natural. And so the question is, how do you embrace those things about you? Just because society might be uncomfortable with it, right? Might just because society might be pushing you kind of back a little bit, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong or you're doing something wrong or that you're hurting other people. So I think figuring out like where that balance is really important. Like you're not hurting anyone by talking to them when they're having a bad day.
Yeah. That's it. Wait, we have to get to Dear Jen, but there is one question I want to answer really fast before that
Okay.
because I think it's really important. It was somebody talked about guilt after setting boundaries with a parent struggling with alcoholism. I just want to make sure we identify that if there is anyone struggling with alcoholism or addiction, there's going to be some level of codependency. And with codependency, there's going to be guilt and discomfort with boundaries. That is simply part of it. If you're struggling with this, please go to Al Anon. Please get help for yourself because that is just going to be part of it. So I just want to say that really fast because I didn't want to ignore that one. Okay, dear Em and Jen.
Dear Em and Jen, I'm a nurse and I just quit my job due to burnout after 12 years. Quitting almost broke me because of how much my identity is wrapped up in my job. A lot of enmeshment there for sure. LOL. I want to do some work around boundaries, specifically in the workplace, so that I have a healthy foundation prior to starting my next job. Where do I start? And do you have particular guidance for healthcare workers? Enmeshment and guilt are ingrained in the healthcare arena, which makes it extra difficult to honor your own boundaries. Thank you both and your team so much for everything you do. You have taught me and others so much, and you really are appreciated. Thank you for saying that.
Mm, God.
Oh, first of
It's
all,
yeah.
we appreciate you for the work that you have done over 12 years. It is such a hard profession. I know a lot of people who are in the healthcare industry. I mean, in Philadelphia, there's so many
That's huge,
healthcare
yeah.
workers. Um, and I think there is a very specific environment that you are pulled into in order to survive in that job.
Mhm.
I also think it requires in a lot of ways, you separating yourself from your own emotional world in order to once again get the job done. Um, and I think that that need for that compartmentalizing or separation affects the relationship workplace boundaries because it keeps you from being able to identify what your boundaries are and be able to set any of those boundaries because you're having to separate yourself in a lot of ways. So, the first thing I would say to you is I want you to reintegrate yourself with your own boundaries. I want you to start to reintroduce yourself to your own boundaries. To say, okay, how am I feeling in this situation? Start to get closer to the emotions that are coming up when you're in the workplace. Um, because that's something that maybe you've had to separate yourself from, it might come much more naturally to you. And because the more that you understand those feelings, the more you're going to be able to decide, where do I need to set boundaries? What does this look like for me? Without that connection to your own self, your emotional world, it's going to be hard to figure out, well, where do I set these boundaries? What does this look like for me?
Yeah. We have great episode with Katie Duke, and Katie Duke has an amazing podcast called Bad Decisions. And she is, I believe, a nurse practitioner went through COVID, put her life at risk every day, and then immediately got laid off. And she talks, I think, a lot very well about just how poorly set up our healthcare system is. So I think one of the things that this person talk about is like where to start and do particular guides for healthcare workers. I want you to really think about whatever environment you're going to go to next. I don't know if you were in a hospital setting. I don't know if you were in a doctor's office setting. There's so many different settings for healthcare workers. I think you're going to have to be very particular about what you choose next. What do you want your day to look like? Because if you know that the system is already pervasive and broken to make you feel guilty and enmeshed, you're going to have to be very specific and intentional about whatever you choose to do. So, one of those is going to be the environment, and one of those is the ability to say no, even when you're being guilted. And that's totally what happens, right? There's nobody on staff. You have to do this. Listen, I'm sorry, hire more people.
Yeah.
I have to say no to this. But you are right. I think especially as healthcare workers, I mean, you feel like people are going to die
Yeah.
if you
And,
take a day off.
and another piece is that no one is happy to be there. Like the people that you're like, no one is happy to be in a hospital, right? Like it's not a choice that they're making.
Yeah.
Um, and I think once again, you suck up all that energy. Like that's hard. And then everyone who's a healthcare worker sucks that up. And then it all comes out in your relationships with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that's sometimes where the enmeshment comes from of like, you're almost bonded by that.
I,
Um,
I mean,
Go
I
ahead.
think healthcare workers are like abused, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
100%.
Yes.
There's a lot of that going on. But, I think there's not a lot of support around it of, well, this is your job, like you just got to suck it up. There's
You
not a
chose
lot of
this.
like, you chose this. There's not a lot of like validation for, I think, what healthcare workers go through. Um, and I think that it's important for this person to validate their own experience of like, what was
Mhm.
this like for me? How did I make, were there certain things that were really difficult for me in this that maybe I couldn't acknowledge when I was in it and now I can? And what do I want to
Yeah.
do with that? And as you're saying, what do I want my future to look like? How do I want it to be different?
Yeah. And that's it for today's episode.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Shrink Chicks.
We'll see you back here next week for another session.
In the meantime, if you want a question answered or a topic discussed, follow us on Instagram at ShrinkChicks. And if you're looking to get connected with a therapist like us to start or continue your therapeutic journey, visit thetherapygroup.com. Just fill out a contact form on our website, and we will personally match you with one of our amazing therapists. And for all of our therapists and group practice owners out there, we also offer group practice consulting.
And if you're looking to support yourself further and support our show, check out our amazing merch options at shrinkchicks.com/merch and our Know Yourself, Grow Yourself journal on Amazon. Also, if you'd be so kind, we'd love a rating review and for you to share with a friend or an enemy or a mother-in-law, honestly, whoever needs it. so that we can keep reaching more people on our mission to bring mental health topics to your ears every week.
Thanks for being here with us. And don't forget to grow yourself. You got to know yourself.